But we are officially recording.
Okay. Hello, welcome to another episode of Coyotenomics.
Yes, and today, the book I read this week, and well, not this week, I read recently, and I want to present what I found from it, is by Debra Soh. That's Debrasoh, and it's entitled The End of Gender. And she is a sex researcher and neuroscientist, and she found that it was very difficult to pursue the big questions coming down the tube in her field basically because of how politicized the whole conversation has gotten around trans issues and gender. And so she ended up leaving the field and has become a journalist and has been writing much more freely about the subject ever since. Yeah, she's great. She's appeared on Joe Rogan. That's how I heard about her. And I really like her perspective because she's coming at it from a very liberal perspective, where she grew up with a lot of gay friends. She very much idealized certain researchers who were gay and were trying to unpack the mystery of what kind of creates the gay brain, so to speak. And it seems like a lot of the research is pointing towards the idea that when different amounts of testosterone are released in utero, that's what creates a lot of the different shifts towards a male brain within a female body, or different types of sexuality, and in terms of heterosexuality and homosexuality, at least. And so lots of females who have traditionally male interests, like interests in mechanical moving parts, tend to be exposed to more testosterone in utero. And the reverse is true as well. A lot of effeminate boys tend to be exposed to less testosterone. And yeah, it's really interesting because it looks at how a lot of the research, while not at all offensive inherently, has been very threatening to certain activist communities, and there's an interesting tension there. This came up, I think, in the mid-90s, when sex researchers were looking at what distinguishes a gay person's brain from a straight person's brain on imaging technology. And they found that certain parts of the brain were enlarged due to exposure to testosterone in utero. And this was seen as very threatening because gay activists were worried that if we can determine what a gay brain looks like at birth, then people might want to abort gay babies. And obviously this is a reasonable fear. It makes sense. I think, as Debra Soh argues in the book, the real solution would be to promote compassion and understanding of gay people, and not be worried that we might attack them if we can kind of define them and determine who they are at an early age. But I can totally understand why that fear exists, and that's kind of an example of the type of tension that exists between researchers that are just trying to develop a wealth of information and insight into, as much understanding as we can bring to bear on these complex subjects. And yeah, essentially more moralizing activists. Yeah, that's the kind of premise of the book. It talks about a lot of different subjects that are very interesting. And I'll just kind of welcome Tyson if you want to jump in at any time in questioning anything. But I'll just kind of talk for a while about my different things.
I'm kind of waiting to see what direction you take it in, I guess.
Cool, so. Absolutely. Yeah, but if at any time you feel the need or the desire to jump in, I welcome the input. Excellent. One thing that they talked about that I found very interesting was something called Autogonophilia. And Autogonophilia is what we would probably call cross-dressing. Also, before I go on, Debra Soh primarily studies paraphilias, which are kinks. So non-traditional sexual proclivities that are not necessarily destructive, but are certainly frowned upon by our society in general. And autogonophilia is, essentially cross-dressing, and it exists only within men. There's a different form of it that exists within women, but it's definably different in a few subtle ways. And so we'll just talk about, this is specifically men who often are perceived as trans, and in the current kind of nomenclature, they are perceived as trans, but they essentially are sexually attracted to the idea of wearing women's clothing. Not just lingerie, but it could be like granny panties as well. So just the idea of women's clothing in general is sexually attracted to them. And the reason this is such a controversial idea within the trans community is that there's this kind of a push for the idea that the experience of being trans is simply the idea of being like a man in a woman's body or a woman in a man's body with no sexual component. And because trans activists have a huge history of being experiencing prejudice because they're perceived as being a kind of a fetishizing movement or like an overly sexual or degenerative movement, they want to distance themselves from the idea that trans is anything to do with the sexual component. They want to say it's simply a man and a woman's body. And unfortunately, a lot of the research shows that autogonophilia is an example of a proclivity that is very sexual in nature. And for that reason, it's been perceived as even an attack on trans activism. And there was one sex researcher who wrote a book called The Man Who Would Become Queen, who was actually quite viciously attacked for writing that book, even though he was very sympathetic to trans issues and trans people in general. He was trying to push the idea that perhaps this shouldn't be considered trans because there are certain areas of the brain that are enlarged or slightly different in trans brains versus cis brains, cis being someone who identifies as the sex of their birth. And he wanted to show that, well, actually, people with autogonophilia don't have that distinction, and there's some sort of difference here, and let's try to unpack what's going on here. And while lots of men who have autogonophilia do identify as trans in order to get certain surgeries that allow them to live the lives they want by wearing, including wearing women's clothing, a lot of them don't do those surgeries and they don't identify that way. And oftentimes they'll answer the questionnaires in a certain way that allows them to get that surgery and that funding, even though it's inaccurate self-reporting. Yeah, basically in a way to circumnavigate this whole expectation that they shouldn't have a sexual component to their approach, I guess, to their identity.
This idea of like a disconnect between sex and gender, I guess. Or
yeah, and
I feel like you don't even know the right terminology, but like, yeah.
It is. It's very, and she goes a lot into that in the book, but it's essentially where it's same thing where she pushes the idea that really what we should be doing is spreading empathy and understanding for people with paraphilias and being accepting of that and being okay with that, rather than trying to push this whole concept underground because it's threatening to a certain community. And like, what if a certain subset of the trans community is definable as a paraphilia? I think that's no reason to degrade them or think of them as any less. I think it's fine to have a paraphilia. Like, if the fear is that we're going to associate our movement with a paraphilia because that's socially, to be looked down upon, then I think the solution should be that we shouldn't be looking down on paraphilias. They're just a natural proclivity that oftentimes are in no way destructive to anyone. They're consensual. So that's kind of the issue around autogonophilia, is that trans activists are, because they ended up spreading rumors that the researcher had abused his patients, had sexually assaulted his patients, had abused his kids, had all this stuff. And there's this horrible hullabaloo where obviously it came out that he did none of these things, but he was simply just trying to unpack an issue and look at it with some more nuance, and he was, pretty viciously attacked. And it's since made it very, very difficult for sex researchers to look into this subject, and they've been very tentative and nervous while doing so, understandably.
Absolutely.
And once again, there is the issue of trans activists don't like the research of looking at the ways in which trans brains differ from cis brains on an MRI, because they're worried that if we can define that, we can look at children at birth and then abort trans babies. But once again, I think we just need to spread compassion for people and kind of stand up for the idea that you're not less than if you're trans, and that's fine if we can, rather than be worried that knowledge might enable us to pursue a vindictive pathway or a prejudiced pathway.
Do you think there's a concern that like those two pieces won't come at the same time? Like, that maybe we need to create a more inclusive culture before we can perform research that could be weaponized by communities that are prejudiced against them. Like I would look at like racism, for example. Like in the late 1800s, there was a lot of very poorly executed research into race that people like jumped on and weaponized as a way of saying certain groups of people are less intelligent or their brains are different or whatever. And like now we can maybe do, and even now I don't think a lot of that research is being done, but like there are points where you can do research and say something like people from Africa tend to have like sickle cell things and things like that because it gives you resistance to malaria, but it has like other effects that are less positive and things like that. But like until you get to the point where like that research just won't be instantly weaponized, maybe we should like hold off on doing that research. Like maybe you need the right environment to do it in, I guess.
I can absolutely understand that fear. I guess my belief is that none of this research or none of the, like when we research race and we come up with the good science talking about race, not the really bad science you were just referencing, but
for sure.
I think there's no way in which that's incompatible with a very egalitarian perspective. And I really want to I tend to fall on the side of believing that we can stand up for what we know to be true scientifically and also have compassion for individuals. And I mean, yeah, I can understand the fear, certainly, but that is that's kind of where I would fall, is I want to believe that we can push scientific truth and yeah, if it is weaponized against certain people, the problem there is obviously that we're spreading whatever ideological bias we have that's kind of condemning these people as perverts or whatever we're classifying them as. Yeah, so
we are saying that from a position of not being threatened by it either, right? Like
for
I would
sure,
say an idea that I thought of when we were researching for this is like often I think white people have a similar attitude towards research and policy changes towards like the idea of like racial privilege and things like that. Like we often feel threatened by it and are like, even if like there's some truth here, like it's going to be used in very nefarious purposes that like will harm innocent people. And so like maybe it's not good for us to have discussions about like white privilege and things like that. And that was like the closest thing I could come up with to an example where like we might feel something similar to what they're feeling, that like as much as like it is research that's hopefully being done for like the right reasons, it is research that could be utilized to institute like racial policies or whatever by like groups that don't have noble purposes. And there are some people who would say we shouldn't have policies that reference or research that's like going into this kind of thing because it's just an inherently bad doctrine.
yeah. Yeah, I can see what you're saying there. I think the bottom line for me is that I think we should continue to have these conversations in a very reasonable, chill way and just to try to slowly work our way towards truth and to slowly try to push and pull society along with us. We just need to keep the conversation going as much as possible in a chill and respectful way. And I think that kind of uncovers these, because both around privilege and white privilege, I think obviously I take issue with certain aspects of the narrative, but I think those can be best addressed through an ongoing, reasonable conversation. And I think the same is true around sex research, where while there are very threatening concepts and there's obviously a lot of transphobia and a lot of tension, a lot of anger. I think we need to bring, as much as possible, bring things down to a calm level and try to unpack things like autogonophilia. And my danger is that even sex researchers who are trying to do that in a respectful way are being perceived as transphobic if they don't gobble up certain narratives hook, line, and sinker.
Fair enough. Did you have more you wanted to go into, or should I just keep like ramming through?
Yeah, well, I mean, about autogonophilia specifically, or other topics.
Or just other topics? Yeah, like do you have more on Debra So you want to dig into?
Yeah, there's tons about her book that are
Okay,
fascinating.
let's go.
Yeah, there's a whole bit where she talks about how a lot of kids who are gay right now are, before they go through puberty and they kind of discover their sexuality, they act and feel a lot like somebody who has gender dysphoria, and that is children who are essentially not sure about their gender. They feel like maybe they identify as the opposite sex, so they could be trans, but they're not sure because they're a kid, and how could you know if you're a kid? So gender dysphoria is like the early stage or early years of just gender confusion, for lack of a better word. And the thing that's happening right now is a lot of kids who are essentially gay are being told that they're trans, or being guided down the pathway of being kind of advised that they're trans. And there's a worry that if they are given things like hormone blockers and other types of therapy or invasive intervention, then they might regret it, because the bottom line is they're not. They, like, if they just spent a few more years developing, they would realize they were very happy in their own body, and they're just attracted to the same sex. And that's something that Debra So is very bothered by, is that she's seeing a lot of kids kind of being, yeah, rather than just being allowed to develop into puberty and to figure out who they are on their own, they're being pressured into seeing themselves as trans.
Yeah.
That's something that's, and yeah, that's just something that's borne out by some of the research on desistance as well. And desistance is a very controversial topic. That's when children who did experience gender dysphoria early in life end up developing to be fine with the sex of their birth, and they no longer experience gender dysphoria, and they become cis later in life. And there's been a lot of research apparently into this over the last few decades, a ton of research, and it says that desistance rates are anywhere between 60 and 90%. From my own research since reading the book, it seems like a lot of the studies put it somewhere between 80 and 85%. But wherever it is,
Back?
yeah.
Okay.
But it's definitely between 60 and 90%. And
it's a measurement of people who like fully switch back, or people who express regret, or like what is being measured?
it's not for, they find that children who actually undergo hormone therapy, the rates of desistance are much lower. This is purely for children who identified as gender dysphoric, but didn't undergo any therapy, didn't undergo any intervention, and they just later on just ended up being fine with how they were. So
like they were gender dysphoric at one point and stopped being, stopped
because
considering themselves to be gender dysphoric.
Yeah, it's because there's a lot of children who are subject to the kind of the watch and wait mentality. There's a certain term for it, but that's essentially what it means, is where it's going to watch the child and be there for them, but wait it out and see, allow them to go through therapy, support them in whatever path they go on, but not try to push any narrative, and not try to push hormone blockers, for one, because there's a belief right now that hormone blockers can buy the child time to experience and explore certain kind of gender identities. And because there's essentially no research done on the long-term effects of these puberty blockers, it's just obviously a very questionable approach. And yeah, the rates on desistance is a very controversial subject. It's something that people are very nervous to talk about right now in sex research, but it's absolutely, I think, if we're going to be empathic towards the situation that children are in, we need to be able to talk about that. And also people who regret transitioning, detransitioners are another group that we don't really feel comfortable including in the conversation right now. And that's something I think that is to the detriment of people who are considering these pathways. They need to know about all the different people who've gone down them before and perhaps regretted them. And this is while fully empathizing and supporting trans people if they decide to go through that later in life, once they've developed to an age of maturity where they can make that decision. And a lot of this kind of references age of consent and at what point you can make such decisions for yourself. But I would argue, especially before you go through puberty, you haven't developed to fully know how you're going to develop. So it's like if you're, a ball rolling down a hill, it's why even decide, I decide I know I'm going to land way over there. Just allow yourself to roll down the hill until you roll down the hill, and then you can, I don't know, maybe that's my incredibly naive perspective as someone who's cis, but it seems to me that it's something that there's not too much to be lost by allowing things to play out to the point where you're more confident and secure.
And this is like just to clarify, this is a conversation that's primarily centered around underage people making these decisions. Like once people are 18, the feeling is generally that they can do as they wish.
Yeah, I think that's generally the thought in the medical community. That's certainly the perspective of Debra So and myself. Like in principle, I have no issue with people making surgical adaptations to their body or identifying however they choose and having whatever type of sexuality, whatever type of paraphilia they want, as long as it's consensual and not harming anyone. And yeah, so I think that's a pretty across the board thing, and it's unfortunate that that's such a threatening.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a couple points I'd like to bring up.
Cool.
There. So first one, I'd like to generally frame the conversation around, and this is not specific to trans issues, but any issue of aneurotypicality. In the last 30 years, there's been a push, I feel, to address a lot of neurological issues. And I hope it's not offensive to say that not to say that it's a mental illness, simply to say that it is something originating in your brain. And there's a push to deal with these things with chemical solutions, which I think is fueled in part by the fact that whatever your chemical solution is, whether it's antidepressants, anti-anxiety medication, hormone therapy, whatever, these tend to be produced by very large pharmaceutical companies who have a vested interest in pushing the public towards these sorts of ideas. If there is to be one corporate winner in the discussion of trans issues, it's the company that's selling hormone therapy, which is very expensive, and is in fact, there are large pushes for the government to fund it, or for insurance companies to cover it, which just makes more money available to those pharmaceutical companies. And I was wondering how you feel about that. If you think there's any truth to the idea that big pharma is interfering in this conversation and pushing it in a certain direction, turning it into a tinfoil hat conspiracy, that is a voice that is active in the conversation without being considered to be one of the vested parties.
Yeah, I think as long as there's an incentive in that direction, there's going to be a pull in that direction and some degree of effort to push that as a solution. I mean, I think that's just a natural part of a financial incentive that strong and that large. Obviously, I don't have any direct evidence of that myself, and I haven't really researched that.
I'm not claiming that I have it either. I'm just indicating a general trend and saying that this may be part of it.
But I would absolutely agree that when you have financial incentives like that, you're going to have a huge pull in that direction, for sure. Yeah, and it is interesting how there's also a controversial subject, or it's a controversy around whether these should be considered or put in the DSM. Is it called?
Yes.
Yeah, and
DSM.
And I think the bottom line is that it is the idea of experiencing this gender anxiety, and there's a term for it where you're just very, very anxious about your gender and your.
Is it just gender dysphoria, or are you looking for?
I think there's a stronger term than that. It's when people are full on into the
gender identity disorder.
Yeah, something like that, and I think that does deserve a different consideration than, say, something like homosexuality, because obviously homosexuality used to be in the DSM, but it was removed. But homosexuality doesn't require medical or psychological intervention, or by a medical professional to try to help you feel comfortable with your body or to help you transition, whatever that is. And I think that's why there is a distinction, and there's no, and obviously that's not to, that's not a judgment upon trans people or people with gender dysphoria or whatever the correct term is, but yeah.
No, and I should state explicitly, I'm not at all saying that it's been cooked up in a lab or whatever, only that if you look at the parties, therapy in the United States and in Canada and in most of the developed world tends to be done by small independent practitioners who have a very small voice in government. whereas medical solutions tend to be delivered by large international companies who have a lot of resources to leverage towards the conversation. And I think it's not a coincidence, without ruling on any particular drug or claiming to be like a biologist, I think we can see that there's a general winner and loser in that discussion over the last 30 years.
Yeah.
That it tends to be going towards chemical solutions to neurological issues that previously would never have been treated with medication.
Yeah, and there's a lot of kind of contempt for the therapeutic solution, like the non-chemical therapeutic solution as of late, because it's seen as almost analogous to conversion therapy, actually, which is fascinating. And the incredibly ironic aspect of this that Debra so points out is that we have a lot of children who are essentially gay, who in any rational society should be allowed to grow up and just become gay and live their gay lives. They're essentially being subjected to conversion therapy to convince them that they are trans. And it's being sold as anything but that would be conversion therapy or anything. And so, it's
like, what would be the word? Like a preemptive diagnosis.
Yeah.
Like really having time.
And again, and so obviously I don't personally, if a child is experiencing gender dysphoria, having a conversation that explores any potential trauma, any complex identity issues, just views of gender, because oftentimes when a child is gender dysphoric, it's simply because they see the opposite sex doing things that they want to do. Whether that means that you're a tomboy, like if you're a girl who's a tomboy and you see all these guys doing cool, fun, manly things, and you're like, I want to do that. I want to play sports and play with trucks. And that's just literally you like you saying you're trans in that case would be you expressing your desire to do what boys do. Or if you're a boy and you see girls kissing boys and you're like, I want to do that, then that's you being gay and expressing a desire to do what. So it's one of these things where oftentimes a therapist, a well-trained therapist, can unpack these things in a very empathic way and guide the child towards a healthy view of their identity without it at all being characterized as anything close to conversion therapy. And I think there needs to be a strong divide between the two, where obviously there could be psychologists and therapists who are like, no child, no matter how you feel inside, you were born a man with a male penis and you will act like a man traditionally, and that could exist. But I think generally speaking, that's not what we're seeing when we see this pursuit to the listen and wait or watch and wait therapeutic approach.
So kind of like on that topic, I wanted to bring up the general idea, and this is delving into dangerous territory, so we don't have to spend too much time here. But I would say there is like a school of thought that is we should be erasing gender differences and moving towards a more androgynous society. Like there is a school of thought where like if we erase all of the differences between men and women and treat them completely equally and they're interchangeable in any role in society, that is like a, some idea of a utopian future that we should be working towards. And that some discussions of trans issues work counter to that purpose. Like sometimes when we discuss the trans issue, we're sort of entrenching these ideas of like little boys behave like this, little girls behave like this. Like if somebody wants to do these activities, like that's an indication of their gender, which couldn't exist in a society where there is no gender roles.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh man, that's such a complex web of things. There's so many things I think you could talk about with that, like the fact that certain trans activists are bothered by certain trans individuals who identify as the opposite sex, but will do so in a very kind of caricature way, like trans women who will become women and will become very feminized, full on makeup, very kind of just like acting like a ditzy, mindless girl kind of thing. There's that whole aspect of it. I mean, personally, yeah, I absolutely believe that there is some, generally speaking, in the aggregate, there are meaningful differences between the sexes, and there's a profound amount of research that's supporting this. A lot of it's brought up in this book.
Interesting.
including early childhood studies that show that, like right out of the womb, men tend to be more interested in mechanical moving objects, moving parts in things, and women tend to be more interested in engaging facial expressions.
Yes.
And this studies have been done on monkeys and also humans in some limited capacity. And there's been some research that's come out that's been claiming the opposite. And Debra goes into why that was misleading and against the much larger body of evidence to the contrary. And so personally, I do think there's a general divide between the sexes that exists. Does that mean that we should see this as a threat to equality or a political egalitarian perspective? I don't think so. I think diversity and political egalitarianism can go hand in hand, and we can see each other as different without being concerned about that. Like, there's a very strange part of the, I guess, equality movement that's threatened by diversity. And I think that that's a dispute that doesn't have to exist, or a conflict that doesn't have to exist.
Like, I personally would place myself on the other side. Like, I am very much of the opinion that, like, gender roles are sort of like culturally prescribed, and that if you really look like across the world, like we have very different gender roles in very different societies. I do know like there is certain, I think I've watched the same video that you must have watched, because like I remember reading about how like men are attracted to different kinds of shapes and stuff like that, like and that like like pictures of machinery are more interesting to young boys than young girls and things like that.
And there's the, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say there's also, I think you might have slightly referenced it, but there's the men are universally attracted to a 0.7 hip to waist ratio in women. And you could say that this is caused by
saying universal, but
well, in when they studied across the world, like in every corner of the world that they have been able to study, it's true. Even with men who are born blind, they prefer to feel a particular waist ratio. So even if they, we can argue that this removed group on the other side of the world, they saw images in media pushing this ideological, like this perfect body norm. I think there is strong evidence that there are, I guess, inherent or biological components to our sexual preferences and our.
I'd be very interested to read that research. I'm not saying it's incorrect, but I've read research like to the contrary of that indicates that like depending on sort of where your society is at, different weights are indicative of like different class structures. So like in certain societies, being very large is an indicator of class because it means that you can eat very well and you don't have to work hard. Whereas in other societies, that's like in American society, for example, it's almost the opposite. Like if you are wealthy, you can afford a personal trainer, you can afford like a tailored diet, and poor people are eating very calorie and sugar rich foods that make them obese. And you see similar things with like skin tones and stuff like that. Like in some societies, paleness is an indicator of not working, whereas in other societies, it's an indicator of like working in a cubicle. And it kind of depends on where your society's at. But I'm not saying that what you've read is more or less valid than that, just that I've read studies directly to the contrary.
Well, I think I have heard that while we have a variety of conceptions of what it means to be attractive in terms of, how large people are, even if one society views larger people as being attractive, they still tend to arrive at a similar hip to waist ratio. That's what I've at least heard. But once again, like I don't personally have any huge horse in this race. I would have no issue. I definitely used to have the perspective that we have almost a meaningless difference between the genders or the sexes, and
now you've shifted.
And I've shifted based on like being into people like Brett Weinstein. He pushed similar research, and I know Karen Strawn, who's a popular YouTube speaker, and so that's my perspective now. But at the end of the day, so I basically believe there are meaningful differences, and allowing those to manifest and being okay with that, being okay with the fact that even if we are perfectly supportive of whatever proclivity exists, there's probably going to be some disparity and some divide, and being fine with that and not seeing that as an inherent evidence of prejudice or bigotry. That's kind of where I'm at now. But at the same time, I obviously support anyone being whoever they would like to be. And absolutely. If it does end up in a very egalitarian, we're all the same on the inside kind of thing, I'm okay with that too.
I agree. I think it's interesting that like being on opposite sides of that divide, we arrive at a very sort of similar place at the end. Like,
Yeah, I think because we just both support people in essentially living their lives as they would like to, as long as it's, not predatory against others. I think it's
exactly. I tend to be of the opinion that it's not overly important how you got where you are. It's more important of like where you are, like
yeah, totally.
whether it's biological or not, like that's the person you are. And
Yeah, and this comes into the whole conversation around like becoming gay. Like if it is influenced by exposure, like testosterone exposure in utero, does that make it more acceptable to be gay? Or what if it's purely a choice? Like obviously there's certain societies in the past where they had much higher rates of, I guess, whether or not you want to call it being gay, but Greek societies had a lot of man boy loving. And I wouldn't say that was
I don't think they as closely attached like homosexual activity to a homosexual like proclivity or like lifestyle. Like it was just seen as like in Greek and Roman society, I don't think they meaningfully differentiated between like homosexual and heterosexual sex. Like,
yeah, and personally, I wouldn't think that would be evidence of widespread lack of exposure to testosterone in utero. I would think that was probably largely culturally influenced. And so I do personally think that there's probably some element of choice or cultural influence at play in it as well. And just how we see people that we idealize early in life, or people that are imprinted on us, how we see them performing, that influences us hugely. But it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, whether or not people choose to be gay or if they don't choose to be gay, bottom line, they're gay. And if they're not harming anyone, that's fine. And that's kind of, I think, and that's kind of talked about briefly in the book as well, is that while there is strong evidence that it is influenced by testosterone in utero, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, exactly. Again, unless it becomes weaponized by a group who seeks to eliminate it or what have you.
Yeah, but the knowledge can be dangerous, sure.
We could bring up like I believe it's Iceland, where they recently passed a law that like you cannot carry a child with Down syndrome to term. Like they
wow.
I think it's Iceland. Don't quote me on that. It's one of the like Northern European countries.
That's surprising.
Like, basically, they've said like we want to eliminate Down syndrome from our population, so we're just like not gonna let it's a forced abortion, I guess.
A forced eugenics program in Iceland.
Yeah, like and there, don't quote me on it being Iceland, but I'm pretty sure it's a real thing in some country.
Yeah.
And their argument is like, why would we ever want someone to like have to live with that? Which is like, personally, I deeply disagree with that, but I can understand where they're coming from.
That's the thing. I can understand the logic. It's a very kind of utilitarian, bordering on humanistic form of forced eugenics, but it's still forced eugenics.
And there's always a question of where do you draw that line? Like, are you going to say like a dwarf, for example? Or I'm sure that's like not the appropriate term anymore, but somebody with dwarfism, like, is that not allowed? Like, is somebody who's predisposed to like Huntington's or something like that, but doesn't have it yet? Like,
no kidding.
I just wanted to make the point that stuff like that is really happening in our world, and so like I don't think it's a completely baseless fear that research like that would be used to kill people.
No, and the person who did do the original research, he was a gay person who did the original research into looking at the physical differences between straight and gay brains. When asked about this, he said, yeah, that is a real risk, and he can totally understand why people would be concerned that his research was being used to more effectively attack the gay community. And so even the person who originally came up with this research will agree that that danger exists. I tend to be I want to push for the idealistic, optimistic side, that I do think we can have exposure to knowledge without it being as long as we stand up for the idea that yes, it's fine to have a paraphilia, it's fine to be gay, it's fine to be trans, none of those things are in any way make you less than, or it's just a deviation from the norm, which is so much of what humans are.
I want to say, like, I'm very strongly against the politicization of science, and like I think it's an issue that science will be weaponized by anyone.
Yeah.
But there is an unfortunate reality that like you lose control of science as soon as you publish it. Like
Yeah, for sure.
Part of the you get the benefit of science being freely distributed through your society, but then you can't control who's going to read a paper on how to make anthrax in your basement and go and do it, right? Like there's always a trade-off there.
Or what like crazy, fringe media site is going to take what you say and twist it in a way that's not quite accurate.
Absolutely. Yes, how like science gets disseminated to our scientifically illiterate society is a different and even more disturbing topic.
Yeah, for sure.
So one more I wanted to make on this point. On the point generally of like perhaps like discouraging people from making these decisions until they're 18. I hear a lot of the same arguments made surrounding tattoos, which is perhaps like a less politically charged forum to discuss it. Like when someone who's 13 wants to go get a tattoo, like people say a lot of the same things. They say you're going to regret it, you're going to want to get rid of it, and it'll be hard. Like it'll affect jobs you go through, it'll affect your future relationships. Like so don't do it. And like that is very like in perhaps like a less dangerous forum. That's something you hear every day discussed 1,000 times in America. And most progressives tend to be on the side of like let kids do what they want, and that's not really a place where a parent should have like absolute authority, or society for that matter, to have absolute authority and say no, you can't get a tattoo within like a reasonable age range of like maybe like 10 or 12 to 18. We generally let that happen. And I was just curious if you think there's like a fundamental line you can draw between those two camps, or if like what your thoughts are on that comparison.
I think there's some truth to that comparison in the sense that like if I had a son and he was 9 years old and he came to me asking to get a face tattoo, I would not let him. And I love the idea of supporting, allowing children the right to body autonomy and all these things, but it's a very tricky subject and there's some push and pull. I will say I think there's some line to be drawn because there is some research that indicates that exposure to hormone blockers and other types of early chemical intervention can cause sterility and other types of irreversible biological and at the same time, as you say, a tattoo on your face is an irreversible thing that's going to affect your job, for instance, accessibility later in life. So I think there's some correlation to be drawn or comparison, but I think, I think because a lot of insight is gained once puberty takes place as well for gender dysphoric children, I think for me, that's personally the big line. Like once someone goes through that and they're like 16 years old, at that point, I would be much more okay with them pursuing this pursuing consultations with a medical professional to pursue maybe getting transition therapy. For me, it's just the line of puberty. But yeah, no, I definitely think there's a very tricky line to be drawn in the sand around consent and children, and at what point do they fully get to take advantage of their right to body autonomy?
Because I think like what a lot of people are afraid of is that like when you look at how like things panned out with homosexuality in like the 90s and 2000s, like you had a lot of parents who actively interfered in that process, and like still to this day, although hopefully less so, you see parents that say like, there's no way you're bringing a boy home to my house. There's no way like you're kissing a guy, like whatever, right? Like those rules are very commonplace, especially in religious communities. And like, I think people worry that like in the trans sphere, you'll see the same thing. Like if you give parents that power, certain parents just won't take their children's needs into concern at all, I guess. And just like with a tattoo, like some parents will just say, no, you can't have a tattoo. I don't believe in it. Like as long as I can possibly exert that control over you, I'll stop you from doing it. And like, I think that's the fear in taking some of that autonomy away from children, is that like, inevitably it either rests with a parent or with the state, and in either case you have like issues of people falling through the cracks or not being treated properly by those actors. But of course, like, you have the reverse problem. Like, the third option is having a 9-year-old make that decision for themselves, and that's not always great either. Like, yeah, just, I don't know. I think we could do a better job as a society of balancing those things, whereas we tend to draw like hard lines in the sand that make it impossible to handle individual case-by-case scenarios. And maybe we could do a better job of like making it a holistic sort of decision, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think regardless of who's in charge ultimately of the decision, there's going to be downsides. I think it's a very imperfect solution, but I do believe parents need to be allowed the authority as you obviously agree, in some context, to make decisions on behalf of their children. And I think because it is a very imperfect solution, there can be very good arguments to make that children need more autonomy. The state needs more ability to intervene in extreme cases. I can see the value in that to some degree, but yeah, I still think that the parents in general are in a much better position than government to know what's best for their children on average. And I think, well, it is imperfect because parents are often so ideologically motivated and biased because of their own cultural context. I think I do think the best solution is to try to address those backwards ideas, those kind of bigotries against different groups of people. But I do agree with you that there's no perfect solution because of the fact that so many parents are tainted by their own history.
I think it's like this same issue of like which needs to come first, right? Like, if you wait for society to catch up before you give that power, then like you're going to have like a generation that doesn't have access to it. And if you go the other way and don't wait for society to catch up, then you're going to have people who are like, and this is an issue we see over and over again, but like neither solution is ever going to be optimal, right? Like, either you give bigots the power or you don't give progressives the power. And like saying bigot and progressive in the most possibly generic space of like people who have good ideas, forward ideas, and people who have backward ideas without specifying which side is which.
Yeah, because then we can all agree on the general abstract principles that you're saying. Yeah, no, I think we probably both agree that there's some balance to be made. And yeah, it's a tough one, and I'm not sure if I can really come up with anything more concrete than that.
We've never talked about this on the show. Like, do you plan on having children in your lifetime? Like, is that something you want to do?
I kind of go back and
put you on the spot. Like,
no, honestly, I feel like it would be I feel like I would certainly regret it if I didn't. I have put a lot of thought into like child psychology and my philosophy and child rearing practices, and so I think I would like to, but I also am terrified of the responsibility and the complete commitment it would require and the change of values, and it would completely upend my casual video game podcast oriented existence, and maybe I don't want that. So
absolutely, I think I'm kind of on the same page. Like, I see myself having children, but like there's a whole bunch of steps on the way there that I may never achieve, is kind of how I look at it. Like, it's like, if I'm like financially stable and in a happy relationship and all this, then of course I'll have kids, but like I might never get there. And I'm not the type of person to be like, I'm gonna like inseminate the first person that lets me, just because I really want to have one.
Oh, like, yeah. That was hot. Yeah, no, absolutely. I would definitely want to. I would hate the thought of just not being prepared, because.
Absolutely. I think this is a totally different topic, but I think a lot of people don't put enough thought into having children, and that causes a lot of the problems in our society.
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of a unfortunate backward situation where a lot of the people who would do the best job are so concerned about finding the perfect context in which to have kids that they just don't have kids, whereas a lot of the people, they're like, whatever, they have tons of kids. And so most of the kids that are born are from...
One day I'd like to do an episode on like how that trend has driven income inequality. Like, if you look at the tendency, wealthy, educated people tend to have very few children and leave a large amount of money to those very few children. Whereas on average, like less wealthy and uneducated people have many more children to which they're distributing nothing. And over time, that naturally leads to like an inequality, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of any like other social policy.
Yeah, wealth inequality is a fascinating one. We should definitely do a video about that in general. I know
they're all about wealth inequality, is how I see it. So, like on some
true.
level.
It's true, but like, for instance, there's a book called, I think it's Race and Discrimination or Disparities and Discrimination by Thomas Sowell.
I was waiting for it.
Yeah. And that one, yeah, it's great. Like, sorry?
How many books has he written?
Oh, fuck, I don't know, like 50 books. He writes like a book a year for the last 50 years.
Of economics. Like,
yeah, social theories and economics. It's like literally like a book a year. It's like a running joke at this point.
Okay, is there anything else that you wanted to get out about Debra Soh?
There's one other thing that I thought was interesting, and that is how people define sexuality or just sex. People will say that, it's defined by the ability to have kids or, penis versus vagina or whatever like that. But apparently in the sex research community or the sexologist community, it's defined by gametes. And that is, there's only two different kinds of gametes: sperm, very small gametes, and big gametes called eggs. And so in the area of sex research, there's only two sexes, and intersex people, even though they have variation between the two, and there's up to 50 different types of intersex varieties, they still produce either one or the other. Even people who have both sexual organs will produce only sperm or gametes. And so, yeah, she pushes the idea that there are only two sexes, and even gender expression, because it's very much influenced by sexual orientation and how these are released. She kind of takes issue with the idea that there's this infinite number of genders, but honestly, how she defines gender is kind of amorphous to me. It's the expression of, or it's how you, like gender expression is how you outwardly express your gender identity. So to me, the idea is that's just how you present yourself, and there could be much more nuances and variation among that. So that to me seems like when she says she believes there are only two genders as well, that to me seems to be fairly subjective, because she defines gender as a form of expression. So, I mean, to me that's like, but ultimately she says that there are two sexes because of gametes, and that makes sense to me. And like they're in biology, because the nature of it, there's always slight mutation in every possible direction. And that doesn't mean that we can't define human beings as having 10 toes and 10 fingers, and, having compassion and understanding for all the variation beyond that. But
absolutely.
Yeah, that's kind of what point she brings up as well that I thought was interesting.
That is interesting. Like, the physical mechanisms of gender are fascinating.
Yeah, and personally, I haven't.
Or of sex, I should say. There are no physical mechanisms of gender necessarily.
Yeah, exactly. Because gender is such a complex, amorphous subject, it's a lot more difficult to unpack. But yeah,
I find it very difficult. Like, and I really do try. I find it difficult to keep up with the terminology when we discuss. So I apologize to anyone if I've used like the wrong terms. I tried to do some reading ahead of time, but like I haven't internalized them to the point where I naturally use them in conversation.
Well, this is something that's very fascinating as well, because they find that even in modern like academic papers, researchers that would otherwise use a term like sex, like they're describing these rats or these mice in an experiment, and they're describing the sex of the mice, they'll submit a paper and be told by the publisher, well, actually, this is great stuff, but could you replace the word sex with gender? And the researcher is like, how do I know the gender of the mice? It hasn't told me. This is insane. You're just trying to placate this new kind of politicized context. And so, I mean, it definitely seems to be the case that using sex or even the kind of like a gender reveal party, that shouldn't be a thing. You don't know the baby's gender, you know their sex, but obviously, people can understand why having a sex reveal party might sound a little bit improper in the context of a baby's sex.
Exactly. And like, my personal opinion is that as long as you're communicating what you're trying to say, and this like when you read scientific papers, they'll say, like, for the purposes of this paper, this is what is meant by gender, sex, whatever, right? Like, and like, it's okay in conversation as long as you convey those ideas properly. I don't think there's necessarily like I don't like the idea of a correct terminology.
Mm-hmm.
Like, as long as you are, like, if you're using it pejoratively, that's different.
Yeah.
But like, if the idea that you're communicating is that like male mice are more prone to a certain type of cancer or something, I don't think what words you use is really important because people can tell by the context.
For sure. But I do think it's interesting that the term gender is being pushed and almost being used to eclipse and push out a word like sex out of the conversation, because a word like gender is understood to be much less attached to biological reality. And there are certain political activists who are trying to decouple the idea of male and female from biological reality and saying that it's all the same and there's no difference. Because there are absolutely activists who say there is no, like, you know, beyond primary reproductive organs, there's no difference between men and women. And they'll like maybe certain secondary sexual characteristics, but and it's being, and I think that kind of goes along with this idea of using gender to replace sex, because it's a much more
absolutely
easy
and
to
I
use
guess
word.
like in a world where like the hormones are widely available, a lot of those differences probably do disappear. Like if we, and I'm not advocating for this future or advocating against it, but if we go to a future where children are routinely like receiving hormone treatments and stuff like that, and like there is no longer a difference between in like physical appearance between, like if you get hormone injections when you're 9, you will look almost like it'll be very difficult to tell that you're not a normal woman because all of your development will be done on like a female hormone cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And like maybe there won't be like a ton of physical differences anymore, you know?
Yeah. Also, there's one of the, they reference how there's different types of hormones. There's hormones that are just like injected into your body, and there are also hormones that are part of a much more complex, just like part of your body cycle, and those aren't part of hormone therapy. So the book also argues that there's much more to development and how a regular person develops that can't be, at least in this point in our technological point in time, that can't be reproduced with hormone therapy. But and just the idea that there's much more to sexuality and gender than what can be created through even sex change operations.
Like it's not even a spectrum, because it's just like it's a web. Like, you know, some people are into feet. Like
I love that. Was like, it's a web. Some people are into feet.
Like, I mean, I don't think like I fully support anyone's like self-expression, and if your self-expression, I wouldn't personally do it, but if your self-expression takes the form of getting any sort of therapy, if it takes the form of like being one of those people who like files your teeth down or whatever, like I would never get a body piercing or a tattoo, so I'm the wrong person to judge what someone would do to their body to feel good about themselves. Like, do whatever you want.
Yeah, cool. I mean, I think that's the gist of what I wanted to chat about with respect to this book. I can't think of any other details. It's a great book, honestly, and I would highly recommend, especially the audiobook, because it's narrated by the author, and she brings a huge amount of compassion and heart to the whole thing. You can just feel the sincerity in her voice, and it's lovely to listen to. And I would highly recommend it. The End of Gender by Debra.
We'll check it out. Final words. I guess I go first.
You go first.
My final words is: do not let corporations co-opt your legitimate freedom movement to ram drugs into people.
Nice. Okay. That was it? That's your final words?
That's my final words.
Beautiful. Okay. My final words are: there is not an inherent conflict between diversity and equality, or supporting people's right to expression however they want. Everyone's different. Human beings are just a bunch of mutations on mutations. We're all different. Diversity is a core part of how we exist and function and grow. And that's not a bad thing. And we shouldn't be afraid of that in our fight for equality.
Good final words.
Thank you.
Next time on Codionomics, something else.